Welcome to Keith Knight Don't Tread on Anyone in the Libertarian Institute. Today I'm joined by Kyle Anzalone, news editor at the Libertarian Institute, to give a summary and analysis of Scott Horton's book, Provoked: How Washington Started the New Cold War with Russia and the Catastrophe in Ukraine. Kyle, if people want to find your work, where is the best place for people to go?
Well, just like the author of the book, Scott Horton, the best place to find almost all my work is the Libertarian Institute. As you said, I'm the news editor. So every day I'm putting out news stories and also a daily news roundup and my show Conflicts of Interest. And then I also write op-eds and viewpoints. I actually have one up at the Institute today. Also, I have a brand new show, the Kyle Anzalone Show. So everybody head on over to YouTube, subscribe. Right now, I'm putting out about one episode a week. It's a pretty high production, high quality show. I'm really proud of it, and people seem to like it so far.
I just saw your video on Syria. It's on my watch later list. I will get to that by today. I love Kyle's Conflicts of Interest show. So links to those will be in the description. This book, Provoked, is separated into sections based on presidents of America, starting at German reunification, Bush Sr., and then it ends with, the election of President Trump in 2024. Today, we're going to be discussing Bush Sr., Bill Clinton, and Bush Jr. So starting with Bush Sr., what evidence does Scott provide that NATO made commitments that the North Atlantic Treaty Organization would not move 1 inch east after German unification?
Yeah, well, Scott has read all the, books from the people who were in the government at that era, at that time, and also all the reporting that was, said at that time, and what he's able to really go through and document, and also the National Security Archives, which have released some of the documents about the, private correspondence, what Secretary of State Baker said to Gorbachev or whatever other Soviet official. And I think, Keith, what is so powerful in like maybe the first 10 to 15 pages of this book, and this is that section, is where they're going through and where Scott is going through and documenting all the different levels of the promises that were made, specifically to not expand NATO eastward of a reunified Germany. And initially, they were even saying that, we want to reunify Germany, but we don't want to expand NATO to East Germany. They, realize, how can you have a state where half of it's in the alliance and half isn't? And so, ultimately they do make, the whole Germany a member of NATO. But and it's not just from the American officials. Scott documents, I believe, German, British, French officials all reiterating the American pledge not to expand NATO eastward of a reunified Germany. And there's also what is explained in there isn't just that they were pledging to do it, but why they were pledging to do it. And it was that the Cold War was over and that there was no need to immediately provoke the Russians by starting to absorb the Warsaw Pact countries, by starting to absorb the former states of the Soviet Union into an alliance that is inherently anti-Russian. And so this is, what was laid out early on, and yet they did it anyways.
That's the amazing thing, that Scott's sources are not like Infowars.com. His sources are George Kennan. His sources are Pat Buchanan, William Perry. He has Ambassador William Burns. He has Fiona Hill as his sources. That's what's just so mind-blowing about this book. What is the problem?
And
Oh,
and,
yes.
and the elected leaders themselves is, Pat Buchanan, of course, is making the argument against NATO expansion. But again, a lot of what's in like the first dozen pages or so. And look, I mean, everybody, this is a massive, massive book here. I recommend that you buy 2 copies. One, you can make like a hideaway book, hollow it out, and put whatever goodies you don't want people to find in there. And then the other copy you read yourself. And read, I mean, the first 10, 15 pages, Keith, are absolutely, I mean, just it's so detailed and it's so meticulous. And really, I mean, knowing what we know now, if you just know what's happened from 2022 onward, or I guess really, 2014 onward or something like that. If you read the first 10 to 15 pages, you go, oh my God, the Americans knew what expanding NATO to Ukraine would do, and yet they did it anyways. Here we have every American official saying they're not going to do it, and they're telling their Soviet counterparts they're not going to do it. They're telling the Europeans they're not going to do it. They're telling the Europeans are telling the Soviets they're not going to do it, and they're all saying this for very specific reasons, Keith. That this would be too provocative. It would start a new Cold War. Essentially, they were saying that they were happy that the Iron Curtain was gone. Right? We no longer have a line drawn across Europe, and there's one side each, and there's a potential war that's going to break out. Right? Europe was going to be the battlefield of a major war if the US and the Soviet Union or NATO and the Soviet Union ever went to war. And that was something that was taken off the table when the Soviet Union collapsed. And the American officials at the time were saying, this is a good thing. Let's not start expanding NATO, because then Russia's going to get anxious and they're going to form some new alliance, and that's going to just create a new Iron Curtain somewhere in Europe. Right? It won't be the Elbe River anymore. It would be in the Baltic states or something like. But they didn't want that to happen, and that's exactly what we ended up doing by expanding NATO more and more eastward.
So if you had to pick one piece of evidence that verifies this claim, that the understanding was that if Germany's allowed to peacefully reunify East and West, then NATO would not expand eastward. Is it that James Baker, Mikhail Gorbachev meeting? Is it the meeting that Baker had with Helmut Kohl, I believe, chancellor of West Germany, or Genscher? If you had to pick one, what would it be?
I mean, I would pick the Gorbachev one, but I think the importance of Provoked isn't that, because you could learn that particular quote from anywhere. But when people, use that quote in an argument, you'll have a Bill Crystal type or someone else try to explain it away and say, oh, well, he was really saying this and that, and try to come up with all these counter arguments. And what you have in Provoked is the totality of the statements made to Russia. It was the number of guarantees at the different levels that really expressed how much that you can't take this back. It wasn't, some one-off statement that was just floated out there and Gorbachev happened to take it too seriously. No, this was something that was reiterated time and time again from the Americans, from our allies to our Russian counterparts. And it was meant to reassure the Russians that we wouldn't go down the road, and while telling the Russians and speaking among ourselves why this is a good idea. And again, it just it happens anyways.
So, what is the problem with NATO expansion? Don't countries join voluntarily this purely defensive alliance?
Yeah. Well, I mean, at the core of it, Keith, it's an anti-Russian alliance. And so from the perspective of Moscow, even if it, is just defensive, you now have an alliance that's directly set up against you on your very border. That becomes highly problematic. But of course, Keith, it's not just a defensive alliance. It's a massive military machine. We could look at the wars in Afghanistan or Libya as examples of, yes, NATO does go to war aggressively and has really messed up the world in doing so. I mean, the war in Libya has had massive repercussions, the latest of which we just saw this weekend with the overthrow of Bashar al-Assad and al-Jolani, Keith, Al-Qaeda, the guy who founded Al-Qaeda in Syria, the Al-Nusra Front, is now the ruler in Damascus. A Saudi jihadist, right, is ruling Damascus. I mean, this is Osama bin Laden's dream, and it's a result of an aggressive war waged by NATO. And so, of course, there's a lot of reason that the Russians would be very concerned and skeptical with NATO being this label as a defensive alliance when clearly it's waging offensive wars. But there's a lot of other reasons, Keith. Whenever we expand NATO to a new country, we start having what are first temporary and then become permanent deployments of military equipment to these countries, right? Now there's 4,000 German troops stationed in Lithuania. right before the war in Ukraine broke out, American National Guardsmen were in Ukraine on the front lines of the Ukrainian civil war, training the Ukrainian soldiers on how to carry out operations. These were American Florida National Guardsmen, right? And so the idea that Russia would be concerned about NATO expansion is because it comes with so much more than just the status of a defensive alliance, right? It's not just a declaration that if you attack Lithuania, then we're going to attack you back. It's a declaration that Lithuania is going to be made an American military outpost right on Russia's border. They regularly carry out war games in the Baltic states within 100 miles or so of the Russian border, preparing for a ground war with Russia right on the Russian border. Or maybe, Keith, the most provocative they have every year, I believe these are the Steadfast Noon NATO war games, where they conduct nuclear drills. So they, take airplanes, right, that could carry nuclear weapons, and they fly them within, I think, 15 miles or whatever the airspace line is of the Russian border, and turn around to simulate what it would be like for the nuclear air raids on Moscow or Russian cities. And so these are huge provocations, and yet it goes on time and time and time again. And that's why Russia is so opposed to NATO expansion, is because it's not just some defensive alliance, it's this massive military machine that's constantly threatening and poking at Russia's borders.
It's amazing because people don't really consider the fact that, one, a war guarantee to Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia, that puts obligations on all of Americans to potentially get conscripted and pay for a military conflict if there's some border dispute between any of these countries. It's a few politicians putting a massive obligation on the domestic American population. So the idea that it's voluntary is just like me saying, Connor Freeman and I had a discussion. Kyle, you're going to pay for the bill when him and I go out to dinner. Well, if it's voluntary between a few politicians in America and a few politicians in Romania, you're still putting massive obligations on tons of strangers, not to mention the moral hazard it creates. It basically says to these people, hey, here's a blank check. You can pick any fight with any regime you'd like, and you have the full force and backing of the US military. My gosh, think of the moral hazard that creates. It's like every drunk guy at a bar being best friends with the big bodybuilder in town. Well, now you have a reason to go around picking fights when you otherwise had a incentive to be a little more humble and engage in a few more cost benefit analyses before picking any fights. I want to go back to what you said about Afghanistan. Afghanistan was NATO's first ever declaration of war. I think it would have been around 48. So for like 50 or so years, Eisenhower and Truman always thought it was going to be in Berlin, that's where the big conflict would take place. Thankfully, Germany was able to reunify peacefully. It's like you got this great deal, and they still provoke an issue on the European continent. But when it comes to lessons we can learn from NATO's first ever declaration of war in Afghanistan, what else is there before we move on to Clinton?
Well, Scott has a whole other book for that called Fool's Errand, Keith, where you could really learn of all the consequences. But of course, we saw during the Biden administration, it was a 20+ year failure. We wasted hundreds of billions, if not trillions of dollars. We lost thousands of American lives. We killed tens of thousands, probably hundreds of thousands of Afghans, mostly innocent civilians or just local fighters who were opposing the American occupation of their country. And the Taliban are in charge of Kabul now. So, what was it all for? It kind of on its own face shows what an absolute failure the war in Afghanistan was. Yeah.
Well, at some point early in my political research project, I thought that the Taliban and Al Qaeda were more or less the same group, and by being at war with the Taliban, we are at war with Al Qaeda. Was there any evidence? Is this, an organization that has a lot of ties? Are these totally separate groups, or did they literally just declare war and start a regime change operation against a totally irrelevant group?
Yeah, well, I mean, Keith, the Al Qaeda presence, the jihadist presence, the international Islamic fighting presence in Afghanistan is a legacy of the American regime change operation, our dirty war against the Soviet occupation and the communist government of Afghanistan in Kabul. And so that the reason that there's even these international jihadists in Afghanistan is largely because the Americans put them there. So anyway, when Osama bin Laden ends up in Afghanistan, he's not necessarily welcomed by the Taliban in Kabul, but they also say that they're not actively going to kill him. Before 9/11, during the Clinton years, they had given American signals that they are willing to let the U.S. conduct airstrikes to kill Osama bin Laden in Afghanistan. They indicated that he was no longer under their protection, saying to the Americans that you could do what you want to him. And yet the Americans didn't take the opportunity to kill Osama bin Laden then. So I think that, kind of shows, Keith, that this wasn't some close relationship between the Taliban and Al Qaeda. I think the Al Qaeda presence in Afghanistan made the Taliban very uneasy, and they rather than be gone.
Certainly. I remember in Fool's Errand, he cites an article from October 14th of 2001 from The Guardian, where Haji Abdul Kabir, the deputy prime minister of Afghanistan, member of the Taliban, basically said, we'll hand bin Laden over to any third country if the Americans provide proof. It's like, well, this isn't just me saying the Taliban are a bunch of good guys. You can say they're as evil as you want. They just don't want a war with the Americans. They're domestic imperialists, just like every other political organization. They just didn't have a big incentive to have a war with NATO or the United States. And seeing that article when I read Fool's Errand was so mind blowing. I go, they offered to make it so we didn't have to have this war in the first place. And Bush went along with the operation anyways. Just sickening. Let's move on to Clinton.
Wait,
So,
can I make one more point on
of
the
course,
H.W. Bush chapter? And so, like, the first half of that chapter, I think and it goes all the way through the chapter, but the first half is like really just drilling you hard that Washington, that our allies made the promise not to have NATO expansion. And the reason they were making that promise to the Russians. The second half of that chapter starts to get into this was all a ruse, right? Like, I guess before reading this book, Keith, kind of my initial thought was that the H.W. Bush administration made this promise. And then it's kind of the dynamic of American politics, right? Where every single president ratchets up the tensions in the situation a little bit more. So Bush says we're not going to expand, and then Clinton does it. But it was clear that even in the H.W. Bush administration, that they were planning to expand NATO, and that they knew that they were leaning leading the Soviets on to get them to believe that they were not going to expand NATO in order to have the conditions in Eastern Europe so that they could expand NATO, right? Like they didn't want a new Iron Curtain to come down. They didn't want the Soviets to get anxious right away that the situation in Europe was going to one day threaten Russia. And so what they were telling Moscow was not only that we're not going to expand NATO, but we're going to shift the whole purpose of NATO. It's going to become a political institution. And we're going to look at other institutions to dominate the security landscape of Europe. And that Russia and its former republics, the former Soviet republics, would be integrated into that security partnership. Now, this gets more explicit in the lies get, I think, more nefarious under the Clinton administration. We could get into that, but I just want to make it very clear that I think one of the things I learned in the first chapter of this book, and I'm somebody who has worked at antiwar.com for 5 years, Keith, and I was shocked by this, is how explicit the Bush administration was, that this really was a ruse, that they were phrasing this in a way, and that they were setting up a situation so that they could sell this to the Soviets, and at the same time start plotting in the backrooms their NATO expansion.
That, I think, is one of the great contributions that libertarianism has to this, entire discussion. Where it's very typical to say, well, if you give someone something, they're always going to want more, and that almost always applies. Almost everyone is always looking to increase the amount of resources they have access to, the amount of social power they have, the amount of money they have. But it's really only the free market that has a true check and balance. And by allowing you to disassociate with bad actors, could you imagine if they had to raise money for these wars voluntarily? If they had totally volunteer armies who they could negotiate with and people had the freedom to disassociate with, there's no way any of this destruction could be would be likely to occur if people could just stop funding it if they don't want it. I mean, people clearly say, look, we basically don't see any, reason to fight a war over who rules the Donbass region. Nope. Send the Banderites the long range missiles, says the Biden administration. It's just so sickening. So that's why I think libertarianism is so important. The freedom to disassociate with bad actors, as opposed to states who coerce you into funding things against your will. Let's
Right.
get into, yes.
Oh, I was just going to add, a lot of times, Keith, they have to actually, it's not only that don't have an option, they openly lied to us, and all of this is covert. I mean, I guess the funding of ads in support for Ukraine was a little bit more explicit, but for a long time, I think from like 2013 until 2015, the Obama administration was running, no, I think it went into the Trump administration. The CIA ground branch was running an operation where they were bringing Ukrainians into the United States of America. And I mean, knowing the number of neo-Nazi fighters that are on the ground in Ukraine, you have to wonder about if some of these people were like white nationalist extremists were coming to the United States and getting training from the CIA and then shipped that to Ukraine. If you look at the initial war in Syria, this was a U.S. dirty war. It wasn't something that was open to the public. The CIA was secretly shipping the weapons from Gaddafi's looted stockpiles and the jihadists from the Libyan Islamic fighting group, the veterans of Al Qaeda in Iraq, to Syria to carry out another regime change operation there. And so there's just so much of this, Keith, that isn't even that we don't have the ability to object, that we don't even know about it. They lie to our faces about it, and then they carry out these essential acts of for treason.
And that's what Operation Timber Sycamore was. They got weapons from Libya, took them to Turkey, and then from Turkey they sent them into the moderate rebels in Syria.
Yeah.
Okay. Let's get on to Clinton. NATO expansion into Czech Republic, Hungary, and Poland. What do we need to know about NATO expansion under Clinton? What was the general response by Russia at the time? Anything you have on what's referred to as the fourth round of NATO expansion? Because it's usually started. The first round is back in 1952. This was the first round of NATO expansion after German unification and the fall of the Soviet Union.
Yeah, and so I think with the Clinton administration, the thing I picked up most from Scott's book, Keith, is just how much that the Clinton administration was really looking to deceive the Soviets. As I said, there was some concern, right, that there a new Iron Curtain would be drawn, that Moscow would get really concerned if they were explicit about their plan to expand NATO all the way up to the Russian border and not include NATO into the alliance. And so
And not include NATO into the alliance, or not include Russia?
Russia into the alliance. Excuse me there. Yeah, and so
According to Putin, he did ask both Bill Clinton and Bush Jr. for what they thought about Russia joining NATO.
right. Well, even before that, in like 1993, in the early Clinton administration, they're talking to Yeltsin and the Russian government, and they're saying that we want to have a European security structure, and implying to the Russians that NATO isn't meant to be an exclusionary alliance meaning, wink nod, that maybe one day that you could join. And so the purpose of all of this, Keith, is so we could start adding countries like Poland and Hungary into the alliance without the Russians thinking that this is an anti-Russian buildup, which of course was a lie, right? Because we continue to expand the alliance. We try to expand it into Ukraine, and we make it clear to the Russians eventually that there's no way that they would ever join the alliance. And so again, in the Clinton administration, you have this deception where we're not really going to use NATO as a defensive alliance. It's more a political structure. It's going to be a European structure. We're going to have the these other kind of defense structures that are going to somewhat supplant NATO, like the European Security Council, things like this, that were supposed to at least what the US was saying, kind of take over for NATO in what was the security of Europe. And that was all like Keith, that they never intended to do all that. They just want to expand NATO, keep it as a military alliance, and keep it as an anti-Russian military alliance. But at least, for the first 15 years or so after the Cold War, they didn't want the Russians to believe that this was explicitly an anti-Russian alliance. It's really only, I think, after like Bucharest in 2008, where we make it very clear that we're going to expand NATO to Georgia and Ukraine, and have made it clear to Russia that they are never going to be members of the alliance, that Russia really understands that this is an alliance meant to surround Russia. This is an anti-Russian alliance meant to surround Russia. And that's what the Clinton administration is really trying to lie to Yeltsin and the Russian leadership about.
I want to play Gorbachev's comments. It is a 2-minute clip. So this is Gorbachev responding to NATO expansion to Czech Republic, Hungary, and Poland in the late 90s, 97 or 99.
I believe it's a mistake. It's a bad mistake.
И меня не убедят заявления, декларации самого такого респектабельного характера относительно того, что России нечего беспокоить.
And I'm not persuaded by the assurances that we hear that Russia has nothing to worry about. That was abruptly suspended or terminated in 1990.
Нельзя унижать народ, нацию, и нельзя рассчитывать, что это так пройдет все.
You may not humiliate a nation, a people, and think that it'll have no consequences.
Ну и другое, это что уже, новая стратегия?
So my question is this a new strategy?
Говорят, вот если это будет продолжаться так, тогда все, о чем мы говорили и перечисляли, целый перечень проблем, их трудно будет решить.
I feel that if
Тогда начнем разыгрывать карты друг против друга.
I feel that if the same kind of games continue to be played, if one country plays some card against the other country, then all of those problems, all of those issues that we've been mentioning today will be very difficult to resolve.
Свободные выборы,
Glasnost,
политический плюрализм,
free elections, political pluralism, the problems of concern to you. If not, it'll be more difficult. Thank you.
So going back to the 90s, this was still the issue. There were so many off-ramps. This was so avoidable. Anything more on NATO expansion before we get into Bosnia, Kosovo, and Chechnya?
I mean, yeah, there's so much more we could say, Keith, but I think we can move on to Bosnia.
Let's move on to Bosnia. What do we need to know about Bosnia?
Well, Keith, I guess the first point to make is that, one of the surprising things to me is that there were a lot of off-ramps to this, particular little incident here, where during the Bush administration, there was something called the Lisbon Accords that would have resolved the situation potentially without any fighting at all. And it was the Bush administration that came into our allies in those were the Bosnian Muslims and kind of told them, like, look, you really shouldn't take this deal because maybe we're going to give you some more support. And then there was something at the end of the Bush administration that also could have resolved it. I believe the fighting had began at that point, and the Clinton administration basically hinted that, you know, don't take any deal because we'll give you even more support. And, you know, this just continues throughout the conflict, where we're constantly promising one side of this conflict that, you know, don't take any of these ceasefire deals because you're going to get something really big from the American side. And of course, the Americans, being the world empire, Keith, and having this massive military force, they understand that even if with a little bit of action, we could have probably hugely tipped the favor in their side. So that's the one point I want to make, is just how avoidable it all was. The second point, I think the more relevant one to today, is just how many of the, you know, international jihadist militants post Afghan war, post, you know, kicking the Soviets out of Afghanistan, they're kind of homeless, right? They can't necessarily go back to their home nations because, look, Saudi Arabia doesn't want a lot of Osama bin Laden types coming home, because they might have aspirations on overthrowing the king and installing a, you know, a more jihadist style government. And that's how a lot of, you know, we're Gaddafi was squashed them had they gone back to Libya. Al Qaeda, or Assad had they gone back to Syria. Saddam had they gone back to Iraq. And so these people are relatively homeless, and their only skills, as explained in Provoked, Keith, is basically being a jihadist fighter. And so now there's a Muslim cause to fight for in Europe, and the Saudis are, you know, happy to ship them off there. You know, the king doesn't want them coming home, but he doesn't mind them waging this international Islamic jihad abroad. And so the Saudis are spending hundreds of millions of dollars to ship and equip these jihadist Al Qaeda linked fighters in Bosnia in the mid 1990s. And of course, you know, this is also important, Keith, because maybe that movement kind of ends up getting extinguished, but rather you have a whole nother generation. Because of course, you know, I think a couple of things that I've learned from watching conflicts over the past 10 years is the lunatics are the most effective fighters. And so while it's nice to think you're going to have moderate rebels in Libya, in Syria, and in Ukraine, you're not. The jihadists, the people who are willing to, you know, walk into a crowd and blow themselves up, you know, the Islamic State types, you know, the people who are really willing to go on these very likely high death operations, that are the ones that will do most of the fighting and the dying, who are going to end up with the most power, because they're going to do very well on the battlefield, especially if they, you know, at the moments where they have relatively competent military commanders or ample US support, like they did in Libya or Syria. So you know, I think this is a real problem and a real opportunity to have had that movement essentially be extinguished, but rather you have them going into Bosnia. And I'm sure, you know, it creates legend and you know, news stories, right? Like, this is a whole nother generation. And so you have people who get interested in it, like that aren't even fighting there, or you meet fighters there, you develop new connections. And all this, I think, really helps to propel Al Qaeda into its next major action, which is, of course, attacking the United States on 9/11.
Yeah, I always assumed there was some selection process with every moderate rebel when you're trying to overthrow one regime and get people to, you know, fill the power vacuum that comes through. I can't imagine like you just go knocking around doors, people call, see if they can get a couple weeks off work so they could take time and overthrow the domestic government. No, it's only going to be these crazy psychos on average. It's not just like there's every Thomas Jefferson waiting to seize the throne of a former King George or anything. So in Bosnia, the NATO alliance was more or less on the side of these jihadists, these mujahideen fighters. Who were they fighting against in Bosnia?
So my understanding is their main opposition was the Bosnian Serbs. And you know, essentially what you have happen here, Keith, is just not a consistent enough American policy. And so, you know, this is the breakup of Czechoslovakia, and rather than allowing either this to break up in a way where it like fully breaks up and all these different ethnic groups get their own states. It allows certain states to break off initially, but then decides to pump the brakes on it. And so when it starts pumping the brakes, now people are asking, okay, so am I going to be a minority group in a state that's ruled by a different ethnicity, a different religion? And these were real questions and things that people were willing to go to war over. And so, I think really it was the Lisbon Agreement that was squashed in the late Bush administration, the H.W. Bush administration, that kind of, provoked the fighting to break out between the Muslims and the Bosnian Serbs. And that's ultimately which leads to, I think the statements of there's ethnic cleansing in Bosnia and there's a genocide going on end up being a little bit overstated, particularly by the U.S. in order to sell the war to the Americans, the American people. But at the same time, there is unnecessary killing of civilians here, Keith. There is a lot of war and fighting going on, and unfortunately, a lot of people die. And the U.S. carries out fairly heavy airstrikes as well.
When it comes to Kosovo, what are the main lessons we can learn from the Kosovo section of Provoked?
stay out of these entanglements, I guess is the main one, Keith. Those are the lessons, right? I mean, it's the same lesson that you learn time and time again. I guess one of the things that occurred to me as I've been reading Provoked so far, Keith, is just how evil the American side has been through all of this, right? And it's no different between what happened 30 years ago and them trying to lie to the Soviets to convince them that, oh, NATO expansion isn't a big deal, to the same thing they're doing today in the Indo-Pacific, building up all these alliances surrounding China and trying to convince China that this isn't some kind of anti-Beijing policy. It's just, it's simply absurd. Or, getting involved in these little wars in Eastern Europe or in Central Europe and trying to break up these countries in the way that the United States want. It simply doesn't work whenever you try to do this. It first creates violence. It creates, anti-American sentiment in these countries. And then ultimately, a lot of times it goes the exact opposite way that the Americans want, or at least that the American people want. Like, I think Washington is probably happy that Gaddafi no longer rules Libya and that they prefer a weak Libya, like a failed state where, there's this migration crisis. Hundreds of thousands of people have died trying to get from Africa to Europe. There's all these, slave trade going on, just a horrific situation in Libya, right? The situation for the people of Libya and neighboring countries is significantly worse because the U.S. overthrew Muammar Gaddafi, right? All that is true. I think Washington prefers that. I'm sure they would say that they prefer Libya as a flourishing democracy, but that's not an option. So if the options are Gaddafi or a failed state, they prefer a failed state because Gaddafi can stand up to some of the things that the U.S. is trying to do in the region, or Israel is trying to do in the region in particular. The same thing with Assad. I mean, it's absolutely absurd to say, Keith, would you prefer Bashar al-Assad, a somewhat secular dictator who at least allows Syria's Christian and other minority communities to live in Syria? Or would you rather have al-Jawlani, a man who on 9/11 saw what Osama bin Laden did and was inspired to fight on the side of the jihadists, not the Americans, right? He wasn't like your neighbor who saw 3,000 people die on 9/11 and thought, I need to sign up for the U.S. military to protect America. He saw that and thought, oh, we actually could fight the Americans. I'm going to go and join Al-Qaeda in Iraq. This is a man who was allied with al-Baghdadi, the leader of ISIS. And there's American pundits today, Keith, telling us that is preferable, that Jolani is preferable to Bashar al-Assad. It's insanity, but this is what these people do.
And even Prime Minister of Israel, Ehud Barak, is on camera explaining, well, Netanyahu actually has a plan to start supporting the Muslim faction in Palestine, Hamas, because this will weaken the Palestinian Liberation Organization and the Black September fronts. responsible for the Munich event in the terrorist operation in the 80s or something. They constantly, I mean, when you look at the 8 years of Bush Jr., the assumption was we need a big government because we got to be protected from radical Islam. Forget the entire Cold War. This is a new justification for why we need a big government, radical Islam. It's been around since the year 600 AD, but 2001 is when we really need to step up the fight against them. Okay, even if you believe that. If you believe that, you have to look at all these counterexamples. You have to be able to look at the Bosnia example and Libya. Not to mention, Scott makes the case that the U.S. was basically the Air Force for Al Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula from 2015 to 2020 while fighting the Houthi regime. And Lloyd Austin's like, I got so mad I almost wrote a letter. That's the defiant spirit we have among the political elites today. Anything else on Clinton before we go to Bush Jr.?
Yeah, again, for anybody who's reading the book, there's a million things that me and Keith are leaving out that's in here. However, I think it's going to take Scott like a month to actually do the audiobook to read all these chapters. And so, we can't get into all of it, but there's so much more in there. Yeah. So let's talk about the Bush blunders.
Who was George Bush's first phone call when it comes to major leaders after the attacks on September 11th?
Vladimir. So, I mean, this is so foundational to my worldview, Keith, because you were, I think, just a couple years younger than me, but I was just old enough to kind of understand what was happening on 9/11. I was 10 years old at the time. And I remember everybody made a really big deal out of Vladimir Putin being the first world leader to call Bush after the attacks. And this was supposed to signal what was reinforced to me by Arnold Schwarzenegger in Terminator 2, which was that the Americans and the Russians were friends now. And so Russia was going to allow the Americans, and I think they did, to use Soviet bases in the former Soviet Central Asian republics. I think Uzbekistan and a couple other of these countries. They provided bases that allowed Americans to get their troops into Afghanistan. Now, I don't know, maybe Putin had some grand plan here, Keith, where he was going to essentially transport the Americans to their empire doom in Afghanistan. And this was just a law employed by him. But I think in reality, it was a real effort by Putin and the Russians to signal going forward that we do not want to be enemies with the Americans. I think at that time, Putin was still very much interested in integrating Russia into kind of the Western world and the Western world economy. There's a lot of benefits to Russia economically. That's why they built the Nord Stream 1 and 2 pipelines and all these other pipelines that bring energy into Europe, because they wanted to be a part of the European economy and the European order. And it was really Washington that insisted that cannot happen. And so, yeah, Keith, that is a really important point to constantly made to the American people, that Vladimir Putin, the guy that we're now told is Hitler, was the guy who called and helped our president on America's worst day.
Oh, yeah, exactly. So when it comes to something like Nord Stream, I can just imagine explaining this to my great-grandfather, who witnessed two massed wars between the Germans and the Russians. The fact that these people have some sort of significant amount of trade, making it in their interest to not go to war with each other, this would have been an absolute dream come true. So the fact that there's like no investigation as to what actually happened when it comes to the blowing up of the Nord Stream pipeline. Basically, I heard it was Putin for a year, and then Seymour Hersh said, well, it was actually the Florida divers. And then the New York Times comes out and says, well, it was actually the Ukrainians. Who was behind Nord Stream?
I gotta say, of the major narratives put out, is certainly the one put out by Seymour Hersh makes the most sense. The one that's put forward by the Western intelligence community is that some Ukrainians on a small yacht were able to plant these explosives. It just seems like too major of an operation. And Seymour Hersh is able to lay out a lot more details and explain how the Americans were able to get it done. There's at least some evidence, the location of the ships, the timing of the war games, and things like that that do back up Seymour Hersh's story. That being said, it hasn't been confirmed in a way that I feel comfortable saying that that's exactly what happened. And Keith, this is something that I was wrong about. After the Nord Stream pipelines were bombed, I really didn't think it was the Americans. It was, I think, the largest release of methane in the history of the world, or something like. This is a major environmental catastrophe, right? This is an act of economic terrorism on Russia, and the idea that you would blow up some civilian infrastructure that brings natural gas into Europe, into Russia, one of the core members of the NATO alliance, just seemed too stupid to believe. That being said, I never thought the Russians did it either. But at this point, I think the most compelling case is that the Biden administration was behind it.
So this is gas going from Russia to Germany, correct?
Yes.
Okay. I just want to make sure that's what I thought it was. So briefly, as far as NATO expansion under Bush, we have expansion into Bulgaria, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Romania, Slovakia, and Slovenia. This is a whole section in Provoked. People can check out. One thing I wanted to ask you from this section in particular, what was the ABM treaty?
Yeah, so this is the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty, and it was essentially a treaty that was set up to guarantee that the U.S. and the Soviet Union, this was during the Nixon administration, 1972, wouldn't build anti-missile systems. And the idea, Keith, is that this ensures mutually insured destruction, right? That no one side could ever shoot down all the other side's incoming missiles, and therefore would have the ability to carry out a nuclear first strike on the other side. So the Bush administration exited from this treaty. I think really the significance here, Keith, is that the U.S. takes, after they exit from this treaty, they go ahead and they start to put their Aegis Ashore air defense systems, or they start to plan to under the Bush administration, in Poland and Romania. Now, the reason that this is so provocative is these systems, while they can fire the Aegis Ashore, or the Aegis anti-missile systems, which are on a lot of American destroyers and other naval craft, they could also fire Tomahawk missiles, which the U.S. used to field a variant of, which could fire a nuclear weapon. And so would put a potentially a nuclear-armed cruise missile launcher within range of Moscow. And that was just too much for the Russians to tolerate. And so I think that's the big part of the U.S. getting out and I'm sure that was a part of the plan all along, right? We're going to get out of this treaty, and then we're going to tell the Russians that we're going to build missile defense systems in Eastern Europe, but it has nothing to do with Russia. This isn't about the Russians, it's about the Iranians. We had to make sure Iran, which doesn't have missiles with the range to hit Europe or Poland or Romania, we had to make sure that they're not going to fire a nuclear weapon, which they do not have, at Poland or Romania. So it's just completely absurd. It's absolutely obvious that this isn't about Iran, it's about Russia. And then they also tell the Russians, well, look, these are kind of minor missile defense systems, so it's not like, this could really prevent a nuclear first strike or a Russian nuclear strike on Europe. And so what are you so nervous about? Why do you care that, we're developing, or we're putting these systems into Eastern Europe? And the answer is because of the launchers, the Mk-41 launchers that can fire the Tomahawk cruise missiles. And so, yes, the U.S. says this is a defensive system, but it's just like a great metaphor for the whole alliance, Keith, right? Where, we say it's defensive, but really it's an offensive weapon concealed in a defensive package.
This is from a section titled Niet Means Niet, the Memos. In February 2008, Ambassador Burns, William Burns, the U.S. ambassador to Russia, wrote a memo for Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice titled Niet Means Niet. In the memo, Burns wrote, during his annual review of Russia's foreign policy, January 22nd to 23rd, Foreign Minister Lavrov stressed that Russia had to view continued eastward expansion of NATO, particularly to Ukraine and Georgia, as a potential military threat. While Russia might believe statements from the West that NATO was not directed against Russia when one looked at recent military activities in NATO countries, establishment of U.S. forward operating locations, etc. They had to be evaluated not by stated intentions, but by potential. Lavrov stressed that maintaining Russia's sphere of influence in the neighborhood was anachronistic and acknowledged that the US and Europe had legitimate interests in the region. But he argued, while countries were free to make their own decisions about their security and which political military structures to join, they needed to keep in mind the impact on their neighbors. During a press briefing January 22nd, in response to the question about Ukraine's request for a MAP NATO membership action plan, the MFA said a radical new expansion of NATO may bring about a serious political military shift that will inevitably affect the security interests of Russia. The spokesman went on to stress that Russia was bound with Ukraine by bilateral obligations set forth in the 1997 Treaty on Friendship, Cooperation, and Partnership, in which both parties undertook to refrain from participation in or support of any actions capable of prejudicing the security of the other side. The spokesman noted that Ukraine's likely integration into NATO would seriously complicate the many sided Russian Ukrainian relations, and that Russia would have to take appropriate measures. The spokesman added, one has the impression that the present Ukrainian leadership regards rapprochement with NATO largely as an alternative to good neighborly ties with the Russian Federation. Ukraine and Georgia's NATO aspirations not only touch a raw nerve in Russia, they engender serious concerns about the consequences for stability in the region. Not only does Russia perceive encirclement and efforts to undermine Russia's influence in the region, but it also fears unpredictable and uncontrolled consequences, which would seriously affect Russian security interests. Experts tell us that Russia is particularly worried that the strong divisions in Ukraine over NATO membership, with much of the ethnic Russian community against membership, could lead to a major split involving violence or, at worst, civil war. In that eventuality, Russia would have to decide whether to intervene, a decision Russia does not want to have to face. For the last three sections of this book, I wanted to invite Dave DeCamp on. Dave DeCamp is the news editor of antiwar.com. He's also the host of Anti-War News with Dave DeCamp. Check out the links in the description to his show on X for that. So, Dave, the next chapter that we're looking at is the Obama chapter. What was the Maidan Revolution?
Yeah, so I mean, this was the major turning point here for the current crisis, the current war that we're in. I'm sure you went over the promises for NATO to join Ukraine, but that kind of went away for a little while when Viktor Yanukovych was reelected, and the Maidan was this overthrow of Yanukovych that was totally backed by the U.S. and other Western powers. And, they were it was completely in your face, completely in Russia's face. You had these American politicians going over there and speaking to the protesters. Victoria Nuland bragging about all this funding that the U.S. has given Ukraine, essentially funding the opposition, funding these NGOs involved in these street protests. And then you had kind of, the extremist element of it, the far right. I know that word has lost its meaning over the years, but when we're talking about Ukraine, we mean it kind of in the traditional sense that you think of it, far right, Nazi sympathizers, the descendants of the collaborators with the Nazis during World War II. They were kind of the muscle for the overthrow that ended up with Yanukovych fleeing to Russia under the threat of violence from these gangs on the street. And it was successful. It was a successful U.S.-backed overthrow of Yanukovych, of this more Russian-friendly leader.
What was discussed on the phone call between Victoria Nuland and Jeffrey Pyatt? Why is this important?
Well, this was huge. I remember when this came out, because there was all this talk about the U.S. being involved in these protests. And, clearly, again, we saw the politicians speaking and everything, but you didn't really know exactly the extent. At least I didn't at the time. I wasn't as into, and I'm sure Scott did at the time. But and then this phone call came out, and it's Victoria Nuland, who's basically the American point man, point woman on this coup at the time, talking to the U.S. ambassador to Ukraine and discussing who should be in the next government. And who they mentioned, Yatsenuk, Yats is the guy, is kind of the famous line from that. Well, F the EU is what everybody, kind of what the news media went with. But the big story there was they were discussing who should be in the next Ukrainian government. And then Yatsenuk was the prime minister after the overthrow.
Did the Maidan Revolution split Ukrainians in the East and West?
So you had, this more pro-Western government come in, and Western, in the sense of Europe and the US, but also in the sense of Western Ukraine. And they were very hostile to the Russian speakers and the ethnic Russians in Eastern Ukraine, in Crimea. And, this gets into the Donbass war and everything in Donetsk and Luhansk, the Eastern Oblast, where there was a civil war after. And they rejected this post-coup government, and they had some, at first, as I understand it, pretty simple demands that they wanted Russia to continue to be an official language. That was something that the post-coup government wanted to get rid of. They wanted their own control over, who was their governor and who was in power. And this led to the civil war, which I know we'll get into. So that was basically, the split is that you have this openly hostile government coming into power in Kiev, and the people in the East who were more aligned with Russia didn't like it. They rejected it.
What was the anti-terrorist operation that Scott discusses on page 324?
So this is the war, the start of the war in the Donbass, when you had these, they call them separatists, but their original thing that they wanted was more autonomy and, again, just respect for the Russian language, which is just a big part of this thing. And Ukraine launched this so-called anti-terrorism operation. And this was the start of the Donbass war that continued from 2014 to the Russian invasion that started the war we're in now. And, it was a stalemate for a while, but this was unfinished. It was a frozen conflict. And it actually did ramp up before the invasion. That was a kind of another factor in the Russian invasion. But what Scott gets into in the book, which is really important, which I didn't, remember this, I didn't realize, was how the U.S. was completely, backing this, encouraging Ukraine to launch this war instead of, meet some of these demands from these Eastern Ukrainians. And also we learned in very recently as well from the New York Times earlier this year that the CIA, immediately was involved in this war, built up all these intelligence bases. There was another report from the Washington Post that came out last year that said how they got to work right away, building up Ukraine's intelligence agencies so they can, commit assassinations behind enemy lines. They can gather all this intelligence about the Donbass forces, which did have some support from Russia. As Scott says, deniable special forces were sent over there. So it was a huge intelligence haul for the U.S. And really, again, for someone like me who's critical of U.S. intervention, when those reports came out, I knew that the CIA was involved, but the extent, it's really unbelievable. And when we talk about this, you always got to put the shoe on the other foot. It's we can't even imagine a similar situation in the U.S. on the Canadian border or something, or on the Mexican border where, the Russia intelligence is involved in these wars. But anyway, it is, this was just such a big provocation, really, the U.S. encouragement and U.S. involvement in this war.
What were the Minsk peace deals?
The Minsk deals were meant to end the war and give the autonomous republics, give them a bit of autonomy, but they were to remain part of Ukraine. Essentially, they were going to agree to have their own elections, and again, give them some sort of autonomy. And they were brokered by France, Germany, and Belarus. It took place in Belarus. And, you know, we've since learned from basically all sides, Poroshenko, who was the president at the time, Merkel, who was the German chancellor at the time, that their view of those agreements now is that the purpose of them was to give Ukraine time to fight this war. Basically, essentially saying that they never intended to completely fulfill those and end the war. They wanted to get ready for a war with Russia. Now, that could also be kind of a face-saving thing for Merkel and these other Western officials involved, because they received a lot of criticism, especially from the Russia hawks in the U.S., who didn't want anything to do with a peace deal. But it is important, you know, from Russia's perspective, if those deals were fulfilled, this whole thing, and you know, if NATO didn't get so entrenched in Ukraine, this whole thing could have been avoided.
Let's move on to the Trump section of the book. Why is Russiagate relevant, and what were the Russiagate claims, and were any of them founded?
Well, Russiagate, I mean, man, there's so much to get into with Russiagate. And, you know, a big thing is that it's very relevant because we don't know if Trump would have been such a Russia hawk if not for Russiagate. There's all these claims that, you know, the big claims were that the Trump campaign colluded with Russia. And then the other claim was that, you know, Russian interference swayed the election. And what they narrowed it down to was Facebook ads. It was about like $100,000 in Facebook ads that some Russian troll farm took out. And then the allegation that Russia was behind the DNC emails that were published by WikiLeaks, which never proven, you know, despite, even though that is out there now, if you ever read any mainstream reporting that mentions that, they call it like the Russian leak to the DNC. And Scott gets into all this in the book. But again, I think, you know, the reason why it's so relevant, again, is because Trump did kind of have some instinct to be less hawkish on Russia. He ended up being very hawkish on Russia. But if Russiagate didn't happen, would that have been the case? You know, I guess we'll never know that answer. But I think it played a big role in pushing him to take this harder line against Russia, to do things that Obama didn't do.
Sebastian Gorka claims that that Trump ordered the killing of like 300 Russians in Syria, probably like Wagner associates or something. Do you know anything about this? Is that what you're referring to?
That's one of the things. Yeah. I mean, that was in Syria. That's something that they like to brag about. I mean, I haven't seen Trump mention this, but a lot of these Trump allies who are more hawkish say, you know, the number I've heard is 180, and they were Wagner mercenaries in Syria. They were just kind of moving toward a U.S. base, and the U.S. attacked them and bombed them and killed a lot of them. And I mean, you know, that's basically Russian forces. So yeah, you know, things like that. Also tearing up the nuclear arms control treaties and giving missiles to Ukraine. You know, Trump saying, "Oh, Obama only sent them pillows and blankets for the Donbass war."
Well, I just remember Russiagate being Hillary Clinton said on the debate stage, 17 intel agencies, civilian and military, have confirmed that Russia was the one who hacked my emails. I know President Biden said 51 intelligence officials, 5 CIA directors from both parties have confirmed that what he's referring to, my son's laptop, is a Russian plant. I know they said that Putin was ordering the assassination of Americans in Afghanistan and paying the Taliban for this. I mean, this is just, they're just setting the stage for creating the evil guy who it seemed like they wanted a regime change war. Do you know anything about them wanting a regime change war, or is it just to weaken Russia, like the Defense Planning Guidance Memorandum said, just weaken all competitors so we could be the dominant force?
Yeah, you mean a regime change war actually in Russia?
In Russia against Putin.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I mean, I think that's kind of a maybe a dream of some of these people, but I don't think they actually have plans for regime change. I mean, unless, you know, you never know. Some of them probably wish that, but, you know, I think the purpose is to really just hurt Russia as much as possible, hurt its allies. And right now, I mean, today, you see Syria, Bashar al-Assad just fell. One of the real big reasons why Hillary and these people really wanted to go after Russia was because Russia intervened on Assad's side in that war. And Biden's speech that he gave after Assad fell, you know, he's celebrating it, even though these Al-Qaeda linked militants are the ones who took power. he's saying, oh, this is the first time ever that Russia couldn't defend this regime, gloating over the fact that, crediting Assad falling to U.S. support for Ukraine. So it's all connected. They're just,
it's all right if Al Qaeda wins, just so long as Putin feels bad. To make him
Yeah.
humiliated, we can give Al Qaeda its own country. Scott mentions war games on page 480. What are these? Why are they significant?
So he gets into this report from RAND, which is a Pentagon-funded think tank called Extending Russia, and basically all these ways that they could hurt Russia, put Russia under pressure, and that includes war games. And one of the things that was very provocative that NATO was doing in Ukraine was conducting big war games. And whenever you see the press releases, they talk about these things like they're just routine business, nothing to worry about here, these big war games. And they were actually doing bombing runs in the Black Sea, like getting 12 miles off the coast of Russia at one point, not long before the invasion. These are things we covered at antiwar.com, which a lot of people might think were insignificant. But again, you put the shoe on the other foot. If Russia or China is doing big war games in Mexico, in South America, up in Canada, the U.S. would not be happy about it. And essentially, that think tank RAND, the idea was to kind of put the pressure on them to make them nervous. And this is definitely a big thing that led to the invasion, just this presence of U.S. and NATO forces actually in Ukraine and in the Black Sea. There was a big provocation in 2021. A British warship sailed 12 miles off the coast of Crimea, and it was a big deal. Russia fired warning shots. There was U.S. surveillance planes kind of hovering above. This was all meant to provoke, as the title of Scott's book implies.
What was the INF Treaty?
The INF Treaty was a really important treaty that got rid of intermediate range ballistic missiles that the U.S. and the Soviet Union both had deployed in Western and Eastern Europe. And these were nuclear tipped missiles that, could reach Moscow in minutes. And the INF Treaty was signed in 1987, and it got rid of these missiles. It totally banned the development of these short and intermediate range missiles. And the Trump administration pulled out of this in 2019. And this is one of those examples of Trump being a Russia hawk. They claimed Russia was violating the treaty with one of its missiles. And as far as I understand it, there were some real genuine concerns there with this Russian missile. But Russia also had a legitimate grievance with these anti-ballistic missile systems that the U.S. was installing in Poland and Romania, because they could fit Tomahawk missiles, which have a range of 1,000 miles. So any land-based version of the Tomahawk would be banned under the treaty. But instead of negotiating anything, Trump pulled out of it, essentially because they want to deploy these missiles to Asia to encircle China. And we're seeing that happen now. They sent this new system to the Philippines. But the Biden administration recently announced that they're going to send these intermediate range missiles to Germany, to station them in Germany in 2026. And they announced that during the recent NATO summit. And that was the thing from reading all the Russian statements that the Russians were the most angry about, was this announcement of these missiles being sent over there. So the INF Treaty, that's a big deal that Trump got rid of that, because now this could lead to just another missile buildup. And it's, when the U.S. and Russia are on this path and there's barely anybody's talking, it's not a good thing.
What was the Open Skies Treaty?
So the Open Skies Treaty was another Cold War era treaty that allowed unarmed surveillance flights over each other's territory. And these days, it's not really necessary because you have satellite images. Satellites can pick up anything that really a surveillance plane can now. But again, it was, a trust building thing. And one point I wanted to make with the INF that I forgot is that Russia offered over and over again for kind of a unilateral deal with the U.S. for just a moratorium on the deployment of INF missiles in Europe, because they both actually wanted to deploy them in Asia. But Open Skies was similar. Trump pulled out of it, and Russia offered to renew it with Biden. And Biden, when Trump pulled out of it, Biden really criticized Trump, saying it was reckless. But then when the Biden administration came in, Russia said, hey, let's renew this treaty. It didn't apply just to the U.S. and Russia. All the NATO countries and other Russian allies, but the Biden team said no. So it was just another, example of this just crumbling arms control treaties.
You mentioned that Trump actually gave missiles to Ukraine, where he said Obama only sent them pillows and blankets. Anything else on the Trump administration before we move to Biden?
Yeah, I mean, the javelins, that was a big escalation. Again, like Obama, even though he backed this coup against Ukraine and they supported and they set up all this intel in eastern Ukraine and they supported the war and encouraged them to fight it, he wouldn't, go take this step of actually sending them what's become known as lethal aid, is what they call it. Because they gave them military aid, they gave them some vehicles and other stuff, but they wouldn't send the missiles. So Trump came in and he sent the missiles. He signed off on the first one at the end of 2017, and it went over there in 2018, the first shipment. So that was a big escalation, and he was encouraged by his, hawkish allies like Lindsey Graham. There's a famous video of Lindsey Graham and John McCain talking to Ukrainian soldiers in 2016 in December, right before the new year, saying 2017 is going to be the year of offense. We're going to go back to Washington. And, this is right before Trump's inaugurated. And we're going to tell them why you need, these weapons. We're going to get you, what you need. And that's who Trump listened to when he took that step.
We're going to make the case against Russia. That's what he said when he's going to go back to Washington. Sickening. So in the Joe Biden chapter, I want to give you as much leeway on this one just because there's so much to tackle. Tucker Carlson's thesis is roughly, Russia said Ukraine into NATO is a red line. Kamala Harris spoke at a NATO summit saying Ukraine will join NATO. Putin finally invades days after, considering this had been a civil war going on for 8 years or so at the time. Do you agree with this thesis that it was as a causal result of NATO expansion and because of what Kamala Harris said at the NATO summit?
Yeah, I mean, I agree that it was NATO expansion. It was very clear that that's what this was about. And Kamala Harris's comments could have been the thing that finally made him go ahead with it. But there were other things happening at the time. Again, in the Donbass, the war was really ramping up. The attacks were really ramping up. And there was negotiations for months between the U.S. and Russia before the actual invasion, and Russia gave them a list of security guarantees, and the big one was NATO. They wanted a guarantee that Ukraine would not join NATO, and Biden even said publicly in 2021, like, "Oh, we'll be able to work that out. Ukraine's not joining NATO anytime soon," saying they're too corrupt, which is funny to hear Biden say that with his history in the country, and also, he says that they're too corrupt to join NATO, but they're not too corrupt to send them billions and billions, tens of billions of dollars in weapons and direct financial aid. But anyway, so they were negotiating, and the U.S. sent back another long, detailed thing. And the only thing that they were really willing to negotiate was missiles in Europe, but they did not address this issue of NATO expansion. They just wrote it off. They blew it off. And there was a State Department official. I meant to double check his name before we did this, but he did an interview with the War on the Rocks, and he was asked, "Did you guys, negotiate, take this seriously, this issue of NATO, of giving Russia a guarantee?" And he said, "No, basically, nope. We didn't even engage with that at all." And again, that was the main thing. And now we saw there were negotiations, and really, what I think should be the biggest scandal of the Biden administration is discouraging, sabotaging the peace talks between Russia and Ukraine in the beginning of the war, because even Zelensky was saying that they don't need NATO. And Ukrainian officials have said since that Russia's main demand in those negotiations was neutrality. All the other stuff was, about denazification. That was all kind of minor compared to neutrality was what they wanted. They were willing to pull out of all the territory that they captured at that point. But, the U.S. just Biden wouldn't give them anything on that, even though, he made it clear that he could have, in his kind of off the cuff comments to the media.
You had a great post on X about how, if there's a nuclear exchange and millions of people die, at least we will have fought the fight of who gets to rule Donetsk and Luhansk. It was something like that, but it was so brilliant that it's like, do you realize what this is over, actually? So when it comes to what Putin's public justification was for invading on page 516 to 519, Scott goes over this. What is this war really over?
Again, it's over NATO's presence in Ukraine. It's over bringing this alliance to Russia's border and wanting to, he mentions in the what Scott covers of Putin's justifications of, talking about all of the war games and the troops being there. And it's about the U.S. not letting Russia have this small sphere of influence in Eastern Europe, in Western Russia. And that's, as Scott makes this case, I mean, that's what this is about. And all the people, Ukrainians, and, have their own reasons to fight, I'm sure, but they got caught in between two superpowers and they've paid the price.
Unfortunately. As far as deciding who rules over this Donbass region in eastern Ukraine, isn't that also relevant whether those people answer to Kiev or they answer to Moscow? Isn't that a significant factor in deciding which territory is going to answer to which regime?
Yeah, well, I mean, that is what the actual fighting is about now. It is that it's about these territories, and also Kherson and Zaporozhye, which Russia controls some of them. And Putin saying, for him to make peace, Ukraine has to withdraw from the territory that it controls in those regions, in those oblasts. And that is what is going to happen. They're going to negotiate some kind of deal eventually over who rules those territories, who they answer to, Moscow or Kiev. And right now, Moscow has the upper hand, has time on its side. So I don't think they're going to be quick to, if Trump comes in and like he promises, works to end the war, Russia is not just going to accept any old deal. I think they have the upper hand here. And I think it's going to end with Russia controlling those territories. Maybe not the whole thing, not the whole oblast, but whatever they control now.
Dave DeCamp is the news editor at antiwar.com. He's also the host of Anti-War News with Dave DeCamp on X. Today's book is Provoked: How Washington Started the New Cold War with Russia and the Catastrophe in Ukraine by Scott Horton. Dave DeCamp, thank you so much for your time, brother.
Thanks, Keith.